And would you pray with me? More of you, O Christ, less of me. More of you, O Christ, less of me. More of you, O Christ, less of me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts make us one with you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. What's wrong with us? What is wrong with us when we live in a society, in a moment in history, when, like Anne told us earlier, every week seems to bring a new catastrophe. Every week seems to bring a new affront to all that is good and decent and just and compassionate in the world. When I put this service together, when I started to think about addiction as a lens for understanding what it means to be human, to be flawed, to be created in the image and likeness of God, and yet still capable of failure and weakness and evil, I did not anticipate the week beginning with the murder of 19 children and 2 teachers in Uvalde, Texas. It's the sort of thing you can't anticipate, but when it happens, you're somehow both shocked and unsurprised. Unsurprised because we live in the only country in the world where this sort of thing happens on a regular basis. But I think addiction actually opens a window into what's going on here, into what's going on with our society, what's going on within ourselves, that this is the world we seem to be living in. I'm going to give a quick content warning. We're going to talk about addiction. We're going to talk about gun violence and mass shootings. And those can be touchy subjects for some of us, so I'm going to offer both an invitation and permission. Permission, if you need to take care of yourself, if you at any time need to leave the room or check out, that's perfectly fine by me. The invitation is, if you can be with the discomfort, to stick with me, because this one's going to be a bit of a ride. The Texas shooter posted images to Instagram of the rifles that he used to carry out the shooting, and text such as, "Kids be afraid." It's often common for mass shooters to leave hints on social media, but the problem is that the hashtags he used to put those out into the Instagram world for others to find them, the gun lovers hashtags that invite people to post pictures of their weapons, particularly in the United States, have more than 2 million images associated with them. Social media is so flooded with gun culture that it would be very difficult to find this one little account and grok that something was about to happen, something unfortunate was about to happen. And social media and the way it addicts us, I think, actually offers a window into the nature of addiction and the nature of the violence that surrounds us. And I want to ask us, how many of us use social media? Okay, a lot of us, much of the room. Not everyone. God bless you, those of you who refuse. I unfortunately need it for work. More than 4 billion people around the world use social media. An average of 3 hours a day. And for kids, for those under 18, it's more like 6 on average. Now, some kids aren't going to use it at all. Some kids are going to use it a lot more. That's a lot of time spent on these online platforms. And I want to ask us, what is social media? Well, maybe it's a way to connect with friends and family. Maybe it's a way to stay in touch with our high school classmates if they haven't turned into reactionaries who want to argue on our Facebook wall. I know a few of those guys. Mostly guys. Or it's a way to get our art, our creativity out there, a way to learn about the news, a way to connect with like-minded people. Perhaps if you're a young queer person in a small town, social media can offer an escape from the stultifying culture in which you find yourself. So those are things we use social media for. But that's not what social media is. Economists distinguish between the use value of something and the exchange value of something. The use value is the utility we get out of it, the use we find. So the use we get out of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube is learning about new things and connecting with people and so on and so forth. But the exchange value of those platforms, well, they don't charge for them, right? Did anybody here buy a Facebook subscription? You don't have to. You'd think for something this powerful and this all-pervasive that, man, we have to pay for 4,000 streaming platforms to watch the shows we want. Why don't we have to pay for Facebook? Why don't we have to pay for Twitter? And the answer, of course, is that if you're not paying for the product, then the chances are good that you are the product. Because we know that these social media platforms collect information about us constantly. They track how long we look at an image, what kind of links we click on, who we're connected to, our location, our buying habits, the music we listen to, the videos we watch, the people we vote for, the kinds of political content we engage with. And then they sell that to advertisers, so they can put increasingly narrowcast ads in our Facebook feed. This does have to do with mass shootings. Stick with me. Okay. And what's interesting about social media is it's taking this desire in us to connect with others, to make our art, to be a part of a wider conversation, and it's feeding the information we give it into an algorithm, and the algorithm has its goal, profit maximization. And it maximizes profit by keeping our eyes on that screen as long as possible. And it does not care what it does. It does not care about the content or the means it uses in order to keep us looking at that screen, because the longer we look at the screen, the more information they can gather and the more they can bundle that and sell it to advertisers. The algorithm doesn't care whether you're looking at a live stream of First Congregational Church on a Sunday morning, or whether you've fallen down a 5-hour-long QAnon rabbit hole. The algorithm doesn't care whether you're a member of a white supremacist Facebook group plotting armed violence against people of color, or whether you're a member of a Buy Nothing group for local parents trying to get baby formula in the middle of a shortage. All it wants is you to look at that screen. It wants you to keep looking at that screen. And one of the scary things about this is that then we become, and particularly our children, this is something I have to think about with 2 small children who are already learning that screens equal fun. The way that these machines and these algorithms and these platforms are getting inside our head and convincing us that the thing we see on the screen is the real world. That that's real community, that that's real relationship, that that's real validation. And believe me, I'm not going to set aside the real utility of these platforms, but they are taking our desire to connect, they're taking our desire for validation, they're taking our desire for belonging, and they're commodifying it and using it to take our attention, to take the very stuff of being human, our attention, our intention, our choice, our relationships. They're putting it in a box and they're selling it. And they're addicting us to their platforms, deliberately building them to be as addictive as humanly possible. Has anybody seen the 2020 documentary, The Social Dilemma, on Netflix? a couple folks. It's mostly interviews with the men, predominantly men, who designed these social media platforms in the first place. And they talk about something called persuasive design. They admit that the entire user interface of their platforms is designed to get you to keep coming back, to get you addicted to the platform, to get you to keep coming back for that little dopamine drip when you see a new notification, when you make a new friend, when you get a new follower, yada, 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 on down the list. And maybe many of us here are immune from that, but our kids sure aren't. The commodification of the human desire to connect. St. Augustine, the 4th and 5th century Christian theologian, father of Western Christianity, for good and for ill, and a great follower of Paul. We know him perhaps today in liberal Christian circles as the originator of the doctrine of original sin. And what Augustine said is that in the beginning, no human is created evil. But we are created with a deep longing for, he would call it God. We might call it connection, community, belonging, solidarity. Higher power is maybe the way it would be described in 12-step. And the thing about being human is we keep trying to meet that need. We keep trying to fill what my friend Aaron, my fellow playwright Aaron, calls the God box with something that isn't God. We turn to money, to power, to wealth. We turn to sex, drugs, rock and roll. We turn to any number of things. Owning a lot of guns, making a lot of money, in order to try to fill this void in us that can't be filled with anything, so Augustine believes, other than the one who loves us, than love itself. And sin is what happens when that addiction to all these things, which may or may not be good in themselves, all these what he would call created goods or subordinate goods, addiction is what happens. Sin is what happens when we keep using them to try to fill that hole in us. We keep using them. And maybe they give us a hit of that dopamine. Maybe they give us a hit of those brain chemicals that make us feel connected and make us feel like we belong, that make us feel like we might actually be the children of God. But as you go along, the thing about addiction is that you have to keep dosing higher and higher and higher to get the same high. And eventually the high goes away entirely, and you have become beholden to something that doesn't even feel like yourself anymore, that feels like it's a power external to you, overwhelming your best intentions, making you do the things you don't want to do, and keeping you from doing the things you do want to do. Richard Rohr, who I mentioned earlier, suggests that we are all addicted in some important ways to something. That we all, as human beings, as finite human beings, fall into this trap of looking for love in all the wrong places. I have some personal experience with it, both in terms of social media addiction and also in terms of alcoholism, which, by the way, yesterday marks my 1-year sobriety anniversary, so I can tell you how much better I feel when I'm fully present with my family, with my kids, with my work, with my obsessive rereading of The Lord of the Rings. Because when we actually get the things that might fulfill the need, and then we don't search as desperately for all those other addictions. I think social media shows that up really well, both in the way that it influences and pulls young men, again, predominantly young men. Maybe there's something wrong with our construction of masculinity, do you think? That keeps funneling young men into violence against children, against women, against people of color. It shows up how we become commodified, how our souls become, our very souls, the very stuff that makes us human, becomes a commodity that is then sold for a profit and addicts us to our own worst tendencies. Because here's the thing, I think gun violence, I think mass shootings are a symptom of a not terribly dissimilar underlying condition. Because Smith & Wesson pulls down $900 million in revenue every year. Because the NRA funnels campaign contributions to people like Ted Cruz, $440,000, I think. Because there is a business model predicated on selling guns as cheaply and as easily as possible. And if that means creating a gun culture out of whole cloth, and if that means creating these rabbit holes for young men to fall down, and if that means lionizing the Second Amendment in a way that, look, I don't always think the founders' opinions should be taken into account. Some of these guys owned slaves. But they could not conceptualize an AR-15. Lionizing the Second Amendment, placing it in the place of a god, and making an idol out of it. There's a business model that is predicated on literally offering up our children on the altar of profit. Because we're afraid of being vulnerable. Our society is so desperately afraid of vulnerability, the vulnerability that comes with knowing and being known, the vulnerability that comes with being in community, the vulnerability of acknowledging that you can't actually protect yourself from life with a house full of guns or 1,000 super yachts. You can't actually fill that yawning void inside of you with more money, more profit, more power. It doesn't work. That the only thing that works is admitting that you are powerless over this addiction, over this systemic sin that creates the political conditions where every time this happens, we have the same tired conversation and nothing changes. That's an addiction. When our best intentions lead nowhere because our political system is so beholden to these powerful interests that it won't take action to protect children, that it won't make schools safe for children, it won't make grocery stores safe for black people, it won't make churches safe. We're so afraid of vulnerability that we create the conditions as a society that lead to our most vulnerable being taken from us. So what do? Well, that's where I think church comes in. One of my favorite studies ever published was about 10 years ago, got publicized in the wake of the Sandy Hook shooting, which, by the way, we've still done nothing, 10 years later. And it looked at what causes violence in communities. What are the factors that seem to be correlated or causative for violence in communities? And it looked at a whole range of factors, socioeconomic status and race and urban versus rural and all sorts of different things. And it found two factors that were most strongly correlated with peaceful communities. The second highest was economic equality. When there isn't a vast gap between the haves and the have-nots, violence is less likely. Makes intuitive sense. But the most important factor that this study found, and it was a study of studies, a meta-study in social science speak, is something called social capital. And I don't love that word, but it's a gloss on community connection. Social capital is when people belong to things like unions or churches, when people feel like they belong in their city block, in their neighborhood, when people feel like they can walk the streets, when people feel like they know the names of their neighbors, when people feel like they have a say in their governance, and they feel like they have a say in the direction their community is going, where people are actually empowered to take action. And in communities with high social capital, we have less violence. And that makes sense, because if you trust other people, if you trust the people you live around, if you're willing to know them and be known by them, if you're willing to be vulnerable with them and welcome them into your life, then you don't feel the need to overload yourself with profit, with firearms, for that matter, other addictions. The journalist Johann Hari says the opposite of addiction is connection. And that's what we do here. We make connections. We make connections with our arts community. We make connections with workers. We make connections with one another. We make connections with our young LGBTQ people. We make connections with our houseless neighbors. We make connections with each other. That's what church is for. I'm not saying this one little church is going to be able to solve all of these vast social problems. But we can welcome people. We can make people feel safe to be who they are. We can make one another feel safe in all our human frailty and imperfection and sin, if that's the word you want to use for it, all our addictions to that which is not love. Church matters. I'm not saying all of American society needs to find Jesus. But I am saying that we have the power in our way, in our community, to break the cycles of death and addiction and anger and hate, and to offer people the opportunity to connect with what is deepest in them and what is deepest in this world, to lead one another home. May we be equal to that challenge. May we answer that call. And may peace be the word we speak and the path we walk and the way we live. Amen.